Okay, vamos. All right. So, antes de comenzar, tengo una nota. Quiero agradecer la comisión de organizadora para me convidar.
Michael, excuse me, can you talk closer to
En
the
this,
mic?
eso, mejor.
Yeah.
Okay. Para convidarme a este simposio tan importante. Estoy feliz. Estoy aquí en Sao Paulo, muito. Siento mucho que no puedo falar bien el portugués y por tener que continuar en inglés. So, obrigado. So, is this ready to go? The screen on this? All right. So, about 20 years ago, some colleagues of mine, Sander van der Loo, did a paper that had the title of Why Model? And I think that's a fundamental question for this symposium here today is why are we modeling? It's a question that I think you can answer in a bunch of different ways. But I'm going to focus especially on my research, which is the value of computational modeling for socio-ecological technological systems. So if we think about why we model, complex adaptive systems, we're complex adaptive systems, right? Inherently model the world. Complex adaptive systems collect information about their environment in order to adapt and respond. But they have to process that information in some way to make it useful. So it's not just a collection of information. They have to do something with it. And so this involves making a model, an abstract representation, an internal representation of reality based on sensory input, right? But also filtering that input so it's useful in responding to the environment. So we make models because we are biological organisms, complex adaptive systems. We can't help doing that all the time. Additionally, as humans, with our complex communication system we call language, modeling is inherent in language. It allows us to communicate and talk about past, present, and future events in many ways, right? But we don't, when we talk to each other, we do not tell every little detail of everything we imagine or experience, right? We filter that to talk about and we create an abstract narrative model to represent the things that we think are most important to get across to others. So these are some reasons why we inherently model. And we can't help but do this. Cognitive and narrative models are just natural to us all the time. But why do we go and create formal mathematical and computational models in addition to these natural ones, right? So that's what we're talking about here today. Why do we go to the trouble of doing these other kinds of models? Well, and I would say that one reason we do it, at least from my point of view, is the Earth. The Earth we live in today is a very complex socio-ecological technological system. And we've made it that way. This is something, as a historical scientist, I can say, just a few short millennia ago, a few short thousand years ago, humanity transformed from being normal. We were normal organisms, normal mammals, and became a unique global phenomenon. There's over 8 billion people now on the planet, and over half of them live in hives of millions of people like the one we're in here right now today. That is not normal for almost any animal, especially not any mammal. A few centuries ago, most people could actually observe social and natural phenomena and figure out what the consequences of their actions would be. and on both on other humans and on the natural world. This is not the case. Just mentioned Dunbar's number, which is controversial, but there's only a limited number of individuals we can keep track of in a social network. Dunbar's number says around 120. So yeah, you can take issue with that exact number, but it's not a big number. It's not 8 billion. It's not anywhere close to 8 billion, right? So we now live in this globally connected planetary network, and digital media, what we're doing today right here, and rapid transportation that I didn't seem very rapid, it was a long flight, but it was actually pretty fast to get here, connect the planet, humanity across the planet, economically, socially, culturally, and epidemiologically, as we know from recent years, in this planetary network of multiple cross-cutting connections that we see today. So this makes this really complex socio-natural system that we live in. And I have to say, no other organism has ever done this, has connected to each other around the world. With things like this, we have potentially access to every other person on the planet in real time, 8 billion people. That's it's hard to imagine, right? So what does that mean? We live in this world that is dominated by these telecoupled human and biophysical processes. So the things that happen in India affect us here, right? The things that happen in the Arctic affects people in Africa. So we have to deal with that. We're accustomed as humans in a recent past, only centuries ago, right, to being able to deal with our world, but we have to change our vision from managing those local gardens that we are, I say, socially adapted to doing, to trying to maintain and manage the dynamics of a planetary system. Whether we want to or not, we're stuck with that. Well, that's the challenge that we have to face. And again, not only organisms, this is something people haven't done before. So if we're not doing it as well as we might like to have it, there is an excuse. We've never done this before anywhere, managing a planet. And so I think this is one reason we need advanced modeling technology to help us meet this challenge, things that are beyond our intuitive capacities. Of course, models can take a bunch of different forms. You can have narrative models, I mentioned those. You have mathematical models, you can have algorithmic models. They can be inductive, they can be descriptive, explanatory, deductive. We have static models, a lot of statistical models. We can have dynamic models. A lot of agent-based models are those kind of dynamic models. Narratives are actually quite common across the social sciences. In my field, trained in anthropology, also narratives, they're easy to understand. Stories are easy to understand. They fit with our kind of natural model-making capacity. They inspire us in many ways, right? But they're very difficult to evaluate in a systematic way. They're difficult to reproduce in various ways. Among quantitative models, mathematical models, which have been around for quite a while, are actually quite useful in certain cases where causes are fairly simple, right? Where individuals can be aggregated into an aggregate individual with, say, some error bars or something like that, where space doesn't matter. But if you have causality that is complex with many, as Daniel talked about, the idea of many different actions resulting in the emergence of system level properties. If individuals in the system differ, are heterogeneous in many ways, if space matters, then computational models are really a useful approach for this. So this brings us to the idea, so that what about people? Right? So human behavior, our behavior, I know this as an anthropologist, result from a lot of complex decisions. They can be rational, of course, as economists believe, but they can also be irrational, right? They can be economic, ritual, emotive, affective. There's lots of different ways, that human behavior and decisions come about. And in fact, the decisions and actions we do are the result of many factors operating together, and it varies from context to context, individual to individual, and individual histories right? So this is why we have variation on how each individual affects or implements culturally shared decision rules. And we have different personal histories and values. And so a lot of people say we can't model humans, right? People are not particles. We can't do that because we're too complex, too complicated. People in society, are really, really hard to represent because of these complications, and we have free will. You know, we're not controlled by instinct, right? This is why we can't model. But in fact, we can model people. This is a project that I ran across on the internet. It's a guy who sets up a camera on a street corner that takes pictures every 30 minutes, just randomly. Then he goes through them and selects them. And so this is on one street corner. And it turns out, and this is another street, a different city, and this is a different city. All these people are all wearing the same, they don't know each other and all wearing the same thing, right? So they had free will. They could put on whatever they wanted that morning, but, right? We don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Even when we think about it, it's not very long, right? If we had to exercise our free will totally for everything, we'd never get out of bed in the morning trying to decide what to do. So we use these kind of rules of thumb, internal calculus to actually go about doing things. And so we can model human systems in the aggregate. Human systems are very regular. They're governed by social rules. Even in the traffic in Sao Paulo, all right, and Phoenix has traffic, but nothing like here, I will say. And, you know, how many times do people drive the wrong way on the freeway? It happens, but pretty rarely it shows up in the news. How many billions of trips? And so people follow these social rules. And then on top of that, because we're complex adaptive systems, the kind of isomorphic properties that govern complex adaptive systems apply to us as complex adaptive systems, individually and socially. So that means we can model human systems. It's highly predictable in a lot of ways. It can be represented by algorithms like these with mathematical functions, conditional or Boolean statements. I just took people through yesterday in the workshop on this, and hopefully they weren't too traumatized by it all. And so human social behavior is complicated. Modeling is difficult. It's hard to do. But then that's the case for a lot of other phenomena. Birds have agency too, and we can model them. Fish have agency, but we can model them. We're not any different in that sense. So we can do this. And when we model people, as I tried to emphasize in this workshop yesterday, the goal is not to try and create a world in the computer. When people see agent models and they think games, right? And then I hear this term digital twins, which really bugs me a lot because they're not really digital twins. Okay. But what modeling is good for is not to create this digital reconstruction, right? But to create a laboratory for bottom-up digital experiments of complex social, ecological, technological systems where we can begin to test ideas in new ways. And it has controlled experiments on human-environment interaction that we can't do in the real world. We can't put a real survivor experiment out there and see what happens. For one thing, funding runs out after 5 years. And so then, you can't run it for 100 years to see what's going on. So because the complexity of social, ecological, technological systems goes beyond our powerful intuitive capacity to track causality, computational models, I think, provide this kind of a truly transformational platform for studying these kind of complex systems. They can help us learn surprising things, counterintuitive things about systems that we wouldn't be able to figure out because we focus on simple causality. So I'm going to give you some examples from some of my own experience in modeling, just as examples for this. And I've tried to make them really diverse, because I know this is, as Daniel pointed out, a highly transdisciplinary discipline and a very interdisciplinary program here with SIMBRA. So I'm going to talk, one example is about the disappearance of Neanderthals, prehistoric people in Western Eurasia who lived a long time ago. Another one, really different, I'm going to talk about modeling how people respond to hazard warnings for hurricanes. How do you represent that? And then finally, talk about something that I do a lot of, interested in modeling smallholder farming and how people interact with the environment when we transform this through agriculture. So let's start with Neanderthals. So who are they? You've probably all heard of Neanderthals, right? Cavemen, you know, kind of like this kind of thing, right? Okay, so really, these are the people. They were a local population in Western Eurasia between somewhere around 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, long ago. I did my dissertation on these guys a long time ago also. And as opposed to what you might see in the popular press, they weren't a separate species. Absolutely, we know that because we know that they interbred with other humans that were around successfully. We have the genetic evidence now. And they disappeared, but they disappeared. They had some distinctive morphological characteristics, just like people today in different places have some distinctive morphological characteristics. But there's nobody around today who has Neanderthal characteristics. Even though you might think you know somebody down the street who has Neanderthal characteristics, they really don't, okay? They really don't. But people today, especially people that have European ancestry, carry Neanderthal genes. And again, we know that because we've been able to sequence genetic material from Neanderthals in the past. So we know that I carry Neanderthal genes to some extent. So what happened, right? They were around for a long time. They're gone, but we all have a heritage of these guys. So the most common narrative, I see this all the time in the popular press and in the scientific press. And as you'll see from my presentation, it irritates me. But you see, man, they somehow, after being successful in surviving multiple ice ages in this area, they somehow failed to survive the last one, right? And it wasn't necessarily the most intense one, the most recent one. And so people say, well, why did they fail? Well, competition from modern people who were much better, right? Or maybe they couldn't adapt to the changing climate. But what about those other ice ages where they adapted just fine? Volcanic eruptions made the world really terrible. The Phlegraean fields in Italy blew up and caused massive climate change, and this is what got rid of them. Or maybe a recent one that showed up, they suffered from disease. So now it looks like that some of the genes that we inherit from Neanderthals actually protect us from some diseases. So what's going on? My question is, what if they didn't fail, right? What if their disappearance was not due to failure, but due to success? That they successfully adapted to ongoing environmental change of the last glaciation, just like they had successfully adapted to the previous ones. So to take you into this, I have to go back and talk a little bit about anthropology and talk about hunter-gatherers. And so hunter-gatherers use the landscape and collect resources, and they do it in various ways. And I'll point out a couple of extremes. And so you can't necessarily classify people that they only do this or that, but these are kind of the extreme ends of how hunter-gatherers use the landscape. On one hand, you see hunter-gatherers moving from resource patch to resource patch. They leave a place, they collect resources and hunt, they move to another place, collect resources, hunt, and move to another place. This is found most commonly in recent hunter-gatherers in areas of lower latitudes because of the distribution of resources. For example, think about groves of fruiting trees. They show up here at a certain time of the year. A different tree has nuts at this time of the year. There's animals in this area at this time, or fish in this time of the year. So people move to take advantage of those resources. And especially in lower latitudes where these resources are distributed in that way. So people are smart, right? They do that, take advantage. There's another way to do this, and we talk about this in terms of logistical mobility, where people set up a central base camp somewhere, and then they send out foraging parties, maybe long distance foraging parties, to collect resources and then bring them back to that central camp. And we find that most common at higher latitudes, colder places, where resources, especially things like large land mammals and sea mammals, are when you find them, you get a lot of resources, a big herd of reindeer, but you've got to find them first, and they could be far away. So you have to send out foraging parties to get those and bring them back. So different distribution of resources, people adapt in different ways. Okay, this is how we know foragers work today. So we can say, well, that makes sense. They might have done this in the past too. And I won't take you, we could talk about this at lunch a long time, stone artifacts. I do this, and some of my colleagues here do stone artifacts. I won't tell you how we get there, but we've worked out a way of looking at stone artifacts to be able to identify whether the people that left those artifacts in their camps, in their archaeological sites, were primarily using logistical mobility with a central base camp and foraging parties, or were engaging in residential mobility. And at the kind of the scale of all of Western Eurasia, this would be the last interglacial around 120,000 years ago. And this is the height of the last ice age, the last glaciation around 20,000 years ago. So in here, what we see is that there's a shift from, in the last interglacial, some people are logistical, some people are residential, and then it squishes down. And so by the time you get to here, everybody's doing logistical mobility. And of course, this is the height of the ice age, and people in Western Eurasia is a cold, dry steppe, right? Lots of big mammals to hunt, but it's not the kind of a world like you might see outside here in terms of the distribution of resources. So this is a sensible thing. And so we can see this is going on. If that's the case, here's some illustration. My hand waving maybe it's better, but for the people online, so here's some illustration on that. So what this means is that people adapted to environmental change through different kinds of land use strategies. And so logistical mobility had some consequences. It means that people moved longer distances to find resources. Expansion of their total range. And this increased the opportunities of interaction between individuals of different groups. So we said, this means if people could interact with a wider range of people over space, this should have some kind of consequences in genetic, in gene flow, in reproduction, and in cultural exchange. And my colleagues and I talked about this, but how could we actually represent this, simulate this in a systematic way in order to test these ideas? So we made a model. We had a model, and we started out and we made a world that more or less looks like Western Eurasia. We populated it with two agent populations. Here's the European Western Eurasian one we call Neanderthals. And this, we just squeezed the rest of the population of the world into here. This is the rest of the world out here. We've actually done a model where I put Africa and other things in there, but it doesn't make much difference and takes up a lot more space on the screen. So these agents have characteristics. They can move, but they only move locally. And they can move small amount, or they can move farther away, and we can control that. They have different fitness. They have different reproductive birth rates, different death rates, right? And so we can adjust that also. We allow them to reproduce. We have little digital genes for this and give them different genomes based on their interaction. And we even put in mating prescriptions to say, to what extent are groups of different background, different heritage likely to interact with and have offspring? And we can say it didn't matter, or it matters a lot. And then we conducted some experiments in our laboratory, computational experiments. And we used NetLogo to do that. And we set these parameters, things like death rate, birth rate, for different kinds of populations to different amounts. We set the movement to small to large, right? We set mating prescriptions to being very strict to being very lax, and did a bunch of things like this. And then we looked at the demographic results of our model. So we ran each set of parameters 1,500 times with 10 repetitions of each one. So this is like, think of it as 1,500 generations on this. And then we track the population structure. And this is a model run. Now notice it started out with blue and red. Nobody's migrating, right? Everyone's just moving locally, but these folks have an expanded range due to logistical mobility. And you can track here on the graph what's going on. And these are the ones that are, in Harry Potter terms, you know, purebreds of moderns, purebred Neanderthals down here. And look at this, everybody's going down to nothing. Neanderthals are going away, and purebred modern humans are going away. And what we see is this one here, and it's a color orange on this. So these are modern humans with Neanderthal genes. And it turns out this is what happens in almost every scenario, right? Unless we make a lot more Neanderthals than the rest of the world, or give them a lot better fitness than the rest of the world. And I don't think that was the case. I mean, they were a local population. They weren't any better or worse than anybody else. And so inherently, if they adapt to glacial conditions, cold conditions, by shifting land use strategies, they're sunk in terms of their distinctive characteristics, but not their genes and probably not their cultural knowledge. It continues on. And this just gives you an idea of bigger picture of the graph there, what it looks like. They're gone, right? But actually, these guys are gone too. It's only these people. Those are the ones that survived. Those are our ancestors for those of us who have European heritage. So they became extinct as a distinct population because they were successfully adapting to their environment. But their genes were passed on, and probably their cultural knowledge was passed on. And this actually better fits the archaeological record than all those other speculations on this. We worked really hard to get this published a long time ago. It took us forever on this before people would finally accept it and publish it. And the one both good and irritating thing is while we went through the review process for several years, the first genetic evidence showing that Neanderthal genes did show up in modern humans was published, which validated this model that we actually produced here. All right, so that's from a long time ago. Let's skip to the modern day, and because of an interdisciplinarily approach here. And so on another project working with the National Center for Atmospheric Research, may it continue, please, I hope, we wanted to try and understand how people respond to hurricane information. So hazard information, whether it's hurricanes or wildfires or floods or anything like that, sure, you can be in the middle of it and see what's going on, but to actually make the right kind of decisions to avoid being impacted, you have to be responding to information about that you're getting in various ways. And of course, you can directly observe it, but you can also see what your neighbors do. You can talk to people in your social network now, especially with the phone and things, see what they're doing. You've got various media sources that you get information from, and regional local governments. All these things are sources of information, and people integrate that in many complicated or complex ways. And so what we're trying to do is how do we try to understand these multiple kinds of information in what's now an information-rich environment, and how does it affect how people respond to hurricanes? As an example, hurricane warnings, not hurricanes, hurricane warnings as an example of response to hazards. And so people, even with perfect information, they may make the wrong choice, or they may do it at the wrong time. And weather reports, as you know, are not the same. You can pick your weather app, and I do this for here, and I check at least 2 of them because they're different. And then I try to average them in my head, right? And different people trust different information sources. So, and they have different sensitivities to risk. It's not going to be that bad. Not going to be that. I've been through this before. Don't worry about it, right? You've heard this. Part of the reason we did this is because we now have all this electronic and digital media, so it's a much more information-rich environment today. And we wanted to ask how emergency management officials could do a better job of communicating to people in a way so that they would make the best decisions. They wouldn't evacuate when they didn't need to and block the roads, but they would evacuate early enough before hurricanes come to keep safe. And we developed an agent-based model to simulate this response, and we're still working with this now. We parameterized this agent-based model in two regions of the U.S. in Florida that are hurricanes come, Florida and the Texas coast and the Gulf of Mexico. It is the Gulf of Mexico, I will say, regardless of what some people say. And so we parameterized it so we could set it up for here or for here. And then we ran the data from real hurricanes. We've got the information from hurricane warnings every 6 hours. It's been archived. At least it still was available then. I hope it still is. And run this archived data as to represent the information that comes into for people to make decisions with. We populated our model with citizen agents that are actually have to make a decision about what to do. But then we gave other agents, we have forecasters, public officials, media broadcasters, weather information aggregators, and they all provide information that citizen agents can choose, right? We don't push the information to them. Agents can choose which information they want to use, depending on their own proclivities, who they trust, their sensitivity to risk. And then we would generate this information just as the National Hurricane Center would do every 6 hours, right? And but then just find out what's going on. We also tracked where the hurricane really went also. And I think I can show you a little video of this in a minute. We let the citizen agents, we either let them be randomly distributed within these regions, or we distributed them according to population density in counties so that they're more realistic. And we could just have them use their risk profile in a random way, or we could have it be affected by their age, their household size, their wealth, whether they had children, things like this. And each citizen agent is connected to not everybody, but some other citizen agents in a social network. And I say they can choose their media sources. And of course, they can observe their neighbors and observe conditions where they're at. This is, well, let's put this up here long enough for you to see, but if you want to see it, I'll be happy to share it. We've actually published this. This is the kind of what goes on inside the digital minds of our agents, of how they take information, environmental clues, and information about the forecast and make decisions. Sometimes the decision is not to do anything and look for more information. Sometimes the decision is to evacuate. Sometimes the decision is to take other protective action, which would be equivalent to boarding up your windows or buying extra water and batteries and things like that. Each agent, of course, makes their decision independently, even though they might collect information from their neighbors or their social network. So, this is an example here where it's parameterized for Hurricane Irma in 2017. There's these bars. This is the projected hurricane. This is the forecast, and you notice it shifts because as it got closer to the hurricane, the forecast, of course, gets closer to where the hurricane really goes, and the hurricane comes through here. I'm going to let this run a second time here. The agents start out blue. And then when they blink, they're starting to make decisions. And they could just pass, but if they're making a decision, if they're green, they're taking protective action. If they're orange, they're deciding to evacuate. And so this is the actual hurricane track. And this is the projected one. And you can see how people are beginning to make decisions in here. And so then we can collect information after we run these models. And of course, we run them multiple times with multiple parameter sets, do parameter sweeps. And so we can track that we have the location of each agent and how it relates to where the hurricane really went. And we track what decisions they make, especially when they decided, whether they decided to evacuate and when. And so we did a lot of this, and we've had a couple of papers on it, which talk about how different ways of putting out evacuation information and things can do a better job or a worse job of helping people evacuate in the right time. But the big question we had is, this looks cool, but are we even close to matching what's really going on out there? And then recently, we actually got some data to help us do that. I'm going to pass this here. Here we go. What we got was anonymized cell phone data from each county in Florida that can tell us when people left their home location and stayed away. And so each of these is a county in Florida. And some of the counties, people didn't go away at all. And in some counties, people took off really early. So we can begin to validate the model we have with this cell phone data. And of course, it's aggregated, anonymized, so there's no way we can track anybody. We just have the count of people, but that's all we care about anyway. So we've been able to try and do this and compare how well we do. So sometimes our model says that it predicts fewer people evacuated than really did. Sometimes it predicts more people evacuated than really evacuated, and sometimes it gets it just right. I will say that we only rarely do we get it exactly right, but nicely, most of the time we get it pretty right. We get it pretty close. I was happy to see this. I think if I push the button here, it'll show. Yeah, here we go. So these are the 5 days before Hurricane Irma arrived. And you see the places we overpredicted and places we underpredicted. We tended to overpredict some urban areas and underpredict some of the rural areas. And part of the reason for that is because we had to limit our model to, I think, around 1,000 agents, because even though we're running it on a supercomputer, Java has some memory leak problems and it would crap out after a while. So that meant in rural counties, the population might be just represented by a couple of agents. And so it's easy to just make an error on that and have the whole county evacuate or not evacuate on this. But I was happy to see it was fairly right. So that's interesting. We're working on a new paper with comparing it with the cell phone data, the mobile phone data and for validation, and found out that there's some things that people with cars are more likely to evacuate than people without cars in Florida. That makes sense, right? You'd be able to get away, even though there's buses. People with children we thought might be a little bit more sensitive to risk, but doesn't seem to be. Maybe Floridans don't care about their kids. I don't know. But older people are less likely to evacuate, probably because they're less mobile. And of course, people without means to evacuate are less likely too. Okay, so I'll switch gears yet again to the third example. Get my water here. It's good. I'm told water out of the Pineros River is pretty good, so it's tasty. So I've done that. So anyway, I do a lot of research, especially recently, in trying to understand what I call the emergence of coupled natural and human landscapes. And so it's not trying to find the origin of farming, but try to understand how activities that we call domestication and agriculture have created this mixed world of both human and natural processes at the same time, where now we live in a world that's completely dominated, right, by coupled natural and human landscapes. So even though there's a lot of buildings here and a lot of pavement, there's still a lot of dirt, and there's a lot of trees, and water still rolls downhill when it falls from the sky. So it's a combination of these processes. So I focused especially on smallholder agriculture, which is the oldest kind of agriculture. And it still produces a lot of the world's food, smallholder agriculture across the world. And a particular kind, which you might be familiar with here, is Swidden agriculture, sometimes called slash and burn, kind of in a derogatory way. But Swidden agriculture is probably the oldest form of smallholder agriculture. And for the simple reason that if you're a farmer 8,000 years ago and you need to clear some trees, as much as I like stone artifacts, stone axes do a really crummy job of cutting down very big trees. It takes a long time. And so if you can burn them off, it's a lot more efficient. And of course, when you burn them, it also produces nutritious semi-burned char and things like that that make the soil more fertile. It's been around for a long time, and I've headed a big project called the Mediterranean Landscape Dynamics Project, where we've modeled this in the West Mediterranean in very, I would say, sophisticated and high resolution ways. I'm going to talk about a simpler model here, but it has some interesting, surprising results. So let's just see. Well, you guys know what swidden agriculture is here, right? Okay, so I originally designed this model, has a great history. It's my first model. And it's the first model because a couple decades ago, I mostly work in Spain, but I had people from Spain come over to the US, and we did research in the US in a similar kind of environment. And we did survey where you walk around and look for sites and record where they're all at. And one thing we discovered is that these little small farms in the uplands of the American Southwest in Arizona were distributed in kind of a really even pattern. And of course, they're abandoned, no one lives there, and they weren't occupied for very long. And so we hypothesized in a paper that one of the potential reason for this is that this is an area of very thin soils and where soils rejuvenate very slowly. And so people would have a farm, and then they would practice swidden agriculture in this area around the farm. You know, they'd burn the pinyon pine and junipers, and, you know, and plant corn and beans and things like that. And it would be successful for a while, but then the fertility would decline. They'd switch to another field, another field, another field. But eventually, there's nothing left to come back. It just comes back so slowly. So now nothing is fertile in the area they farmed, and so they have to give up their farmstead and move to another farmstead. And of course, they have to move outside the zone they've farmed. And this happens for everybody. And if everybody's doing this, they become kind of evenly spaced related to the size of the areas farmed. I thought, well, would that actually work? So I built a really simple agent-based model to test that, and I've done a lot since then with it. And so you can see this is one run of it. And these little red things are the little farms. And eventually, if the soil is not fertile, they will all get abandoned. And then you end up with a nice evenly spaced distribution of farms. Now, it turns out that's not the only way you can get it, but that process does create the kind of record that we saw empirically. So I was happy about that. But I've used this as something kind of a test model to try out multiple kinds of ideas. And so these are the kinds, so I've added increasing amounts of stuff in here. And so I have human decisions, how much area to farm, you know, whether big or small area to actually farm, when it's time to clear a new path, how much does fertility have to decline before you clear a new patch? Where do you want to do it, given that you have to walk to it and get back, and there's costs to go there and there's costs to clear it and you get certain harvests back. When do you give up and move to a new farm? And so if it starts slow, and if you're really successful, can you have a daughter farm that comes off? So your kids or stuff can start a new farm. So when does that happen? And then there's environmental information. So there's the return on the harvest, which you can vary. How much energy does it take to actually farm? What does it need to clear land to move to a new location? What's the fertility loss rate? A lot of stuff like this, things that would be impossible to think about intuitively. We know they're important, but how do they interact? So it turns out that if you can't restore fertility, eventually all the farms get abandoned. Well, that makes sense. You know, over time, if the land plays out, you can't farm there. And I mean, you could take it two ways. You could say everybody moved away, or you could say everybody died. So I kind of think about everybody moved away as maybe a little bit kinder and gentler way to think about it. But if it can be restored at some level, then you can end up with a stable system, a stable distribution of farms and farming that lasts for a long period of time. This represents the population, household population here. This one gets up here and finds a stable equilibrium and stays there. These are harvest returns, and then I have environmental information down here, different kinds of environmental land cover. So you can create this stable system. So, but then I thought, well, there's some things a little bit different here. So the way I designed it once a farm decided to farm in a place and they said, we're going to farm an area this size, they kept it. Nobody else could farm there. They owned it. And that's the case in some ways. But we know that today, of course, and even in the past, sometimes people didn't do that. If they weren't actively farming some area, right? They could transfer it to somebody else. They could sell it. They could trade it. They could do something, short term to get a loan. They could mortgage their land, right? So what happens if you do that? So I added the possibility that that land could be transferred and available to other farmers if it had not been farmed for some length of time, which you could pick a fallow time. So one thing that happens when you do that, you can end up with a stable population over time, and you can get a lot more people on the land. If you remember this picture with the one earlier, and the size of these little houses represents the number of people in each household. So there's some really quite big ones as well as little ones, and there's a lot more. So you can pack people in, so you can have a much greater population if you change your land management rules to allow people to efficiently use the land. Areas that are not needed for farming, then they could be given, sold, transferred to somebody else, and you can have a significant population increase. And then I started playing around with it and said, well, what happens if there was originally set it up so that if it was fallowed for 20 years, a long fallow system, then you could transfer it. Well, what happens if you did it for less than 20 years? Would you get more people? Well, so you do it for 15 years. Yes, you get more people. The scale in this is different. Bigger houses, a lot more people. And actually, you get some more decline in the returns, just enough to maintain stability, but it's still there. And you get more people. So, okay, well, if I decrease it more, do I get a linear relationship? The more I decrease the fallow system, the more the population goes up. Well, as we get to some surprises. So I drop it down to 13 years. And I was like, well, wait a minute. So here's population, goes up like this, then it goes down, then it comes up. And we see these various quite different effects in fertility and harvest returns. And the environment starts getting kind of weird in terms of the land degradation. And I said, well, let's drop it down just a little more. How about to 10? Holy cow, we end up with this kind of a situation. So population density at the peak is really high. There's some big ones here, but then it can drop it precipitously. And you end up with these population boom and busts over time. Environmental degradation is severe, and there's real fluctuation in harvest returns and fertility on this. There's no longer any kind of stability, not even kind of a stable decline, okay? It becomes extremely unpredictable. And if I drop it down to 5 years, it's even worse. And you can even have situations where the entire population goes extinct on this. So what's happened is, by slight changes in land management rules, I've shifted to a totally new regime. This is an example of a tipping point, a regime shift in kind of the interaction between people and the environment, something I did not expect at all. And so I find this has been really interesting. I finally put a paper out on this talking about some of it, and I'll show one slide to finish up in a bit. Then I added, since I was saying, well, what's the best way to do this? Because I could try different sliders and things. So I added a genetic algorithm so I could randomize the farms and their decision processes to begin with. And then when a farm had a new farm, started a new farm, their daughter farm would have the same rules, but with the possibility of innovation, like a mutation in something, right? And successful practices, combinations of practices, would have a surviving lineage, and ones that weren't successful would go extinct. And then I could analyze the results and see what the successful strategies were after some period of time. And so I'll show you that in just a minute. So I want to wind up by saying that science is not technology. In spite of what shows up in the popular press, we know that as scientists, right? It's a way of understanding the world. But some technologies can transform science in many ways. If we think about the telescope, it really changed how we think about our place in the universe and the universe in general. I mean, so much so that Galileo got in trouble with the authorities over this, right? Very controversial, but totally changed how we think about our place in the universe. The microscope did it at the other end. And so no longer, it was now clear, right, that flies did not emerge from decaying meat, right? That different vapors did not cause different illnesses. That malaria was not caused by bad air. And so this transformed our understanding of disease as well as biology. And of course, particle accelerators in the 20th century have changed how we understand matter and energy and the relationship between these things. We just didn't know that before. And so I think these kind of tools that we're talking about here in this symposium can help us understand and anticipate these dynamics of the complex world that we live in today, and helps us, like I was looking at the farming model and the Neanderthal model, understand causation that tend to be hidden when this is part of the idea of emergence, the idea of how local scale interactions and behaviors and decisions can create larger scale patterns that are maybe not impossible to predict, but are very difficult to intuit, and maybe help us be better managers of our planet by anticipating better the long-term consequences of our decisions and actions today. And the other thing, I think, is it helps us communicate these kind of complex decisions, interactions, the idea of emergence in quantitative forms across different disciplines. And some that Daniel brought out. And so it's a way to communicate these things. And I, as a socio-ecological scientist, it's great because it lets us do experimental socio-ecological science, something that can't really do in the real world. And so this is, in Stephen Gould's words, we can actually rerun the tape of evolution, social evolution, something you can't do in the real world. So I want to acknowledge all the supporters of this work. There's been a lot. At ASU and internationally, including here and FAPESP and the University of Sao Paulo. Pardon me. And then I'll leave you with this for questions. This is my genetic algorithm running, and different colors represent different household norms and lineages. So you can trace those colors and things. So thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions too. So,
Thank you. Thank you, professor. Para quem estiver assistindo online, vocês têm que mandar as perguntas, caso vocês tenham, no chat, para a gente poder coordenar ali. No Eventtree, isso. Não é no YouTube. Tá? Acho que no YouTube nem está liberado para fazer comentários. E quem tiver pergunta, pode levantar a mão, fica à vontade. A gente tem um microfone ali para vocês falarem, não porque aqui eu sei que dá para a gente ouvir, mas como a gente vai depois usar as gravações para a gente usar no livro de resumo, as transcrições e tudo mais, então é bom que a gente tenha um microfone para vocês falarem também, para a gente aproveitar esse momento, tá? Então, fique à vontade.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful. I have just one question that is in my mind when you told us that the process that you, the time that you spent while trying to publish your first paper on the Neanderthals, right? And the first time I saw those kinds of models, I was fascinated. I think it was the first time I saw something like this, it was called like historical ecology or something like that.
Socio-ecology of prehistoric socio-ecology of Pleistocene ecosystems or something. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. and so fascinating. I was wondering, how is this acceptance today regarding these kind of models in archaeology, in anthropology? Can you talk more about those evolution, right?
I think acceptance is better, a lot better. I mean, there's still a cohort of archaeologists and social scientists in general that are, I want to say, just have a gut antagonism toward any kind of quantification and modeling. It's like, we just can't do this. It takes away our humanity. I go, no, it actually helps us understand our humanity, at least from my perspective. But I think it's a lot wider spread. There have been, at least in archaeology now, a number of symposia on agent-based modeling in archaeology. I think I and some colleagues held one of the first ones back in Hawaii some years ago, but there's been quite a few since then. There's been a great book that's come out by some of our colleagues, Stephanie Crabtree, Isa Romanowska, and Colin Wren on agent-based modeling in archaeology. So I think it's wider. It's still a minority, right? But I would still say there's still not everybody uses GIS in archaeology, and that seems like it's inherent in archaeology. So it's growing, and I think there's not the kind of resistance that we had before to this. And it took us close to 3 years to get this published. Though I will say, in all honesty, that wasn't entirely because of the modeling. In fact, a lot of the reviewers had no idea at all what we were doing in the modeling. They were upset about the empirical data that we had. So anyway, but when they thought about the modeling, they were bothered by it. But I think there's much less of that. The one thing we've seen repeatedly, because I've done a lot of these models in archaeology, is reviewers that come back and say, oh, well, but it's just a model. And I'm going, well, what's your narrative? You know, your story about it, that's a model too. And I'm hoping to get away from that. So the just a model critique, because we need to go beyond that.
Professor, thank you for this presentation. As Daniel said, very insightful. I have some question about the time series that your model produces. It's a more curiosity. Do you use some mathematical tools to try to understand the forecasts of the time series about your models? It's like you have n time series, and the question is about, do you think about like how can I understand the next steps of my agents, but looking for the time series? So like how did my time series can be classified in different regimes, how I can make the forecast of my time series and identify some emergent states looking only for the time series. Do you have some tools like that? It's more curiosity.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to, if I think I understand what you're asking on this, there's a couple of ways to look at this. And one, I did a model for teaching purposes that I really enhanced back in 2020 about epidemiology and the spread of epidemics. It turned out that, oh, wow, this is a useful model, especially right now. And when presenting this to some students in a complexity class, dynamic systems modeler and I worked together. And so I could run my agent-based model and you get the time series data and then use that to construct a mathematical model that would replicate the same thing. So that's one thing to do. And then a couple of years ago, I saw, I think, a really cool paper, and I haven't seen anybody follow it up. And he said that, you know, most of the time we do agent-based models, we run them and we get the end and we analyze the end state. And that's okay. I said, but what happens along the way is really important. And so we should also be looking at trajectories. And he came up with, this team came up with some tools, and I could try to find the paper if you're interested, on how do we analyze the trajectories with this. And so finally, on our Medlin model, the Mediterranean landscape dynamics model, where we have, it's a much more sophisticated and much more, this is very abstract. It's a highly parameterized model of smallholder farming. And it creates landscapes that evolve so we can have erosion and deposition in meters across the whole landscape and vegetation. And we have, so we want to ask is how can we validate that model? It's a beautiful model of landscapes, but the data are bags of dirt and little broken pieces of pottery and things like that. So what we did is we created a way to generate a digital core down through our time series in a place that we just decided this is a good place to do it. And then we could match it to the same place in the real world and create a digital core and convert our vegetation to charcoal, look at our sediment, convert vegetation to phytoliths and burning to charcoal and artifacts. And then we could go out and look at a real core. And so we've done that in a prototype to see how it works. And it works pretty well. I mean, there's some things that we need to change on it. And it actually showed us some things about the model and how we might want to change how it's parameterized and how we thought about the time steps. So this is yet another way to deal with the modeling time series.
Mais perguntas? More questions?
Hey, I have a question for example, in a case where we don't have the data or it's hard to get the data to validate a simulation, is it still worth it to create the simulation? Or what, do you have any tips for, oh, in this case, it's worth it to work on a simulation even if you don't have the data to validate it, or in some cases it's not worth it? Well,
it depends. So this is where I think if you're making models, it's really, really, really important to have research questions and goals in mind. What is it you want to learn? And so in that case, if you have some goals of learning certain things, the simulation can actually help you translate ideas and to operationalize ideas just to test whether or not they meet, your expectations in this. So there's a book on modeling and complexity by John Miller and Scott Page, talks about modeling as a way to develop and operationalize theory. And so models help us build theory. It takes our ideas and we have to get much more explicit about it. In my field in anthropology and archaeology, they talk about, oh, there's the influence from here to here. Well, if you actually write a computational model, you have to say, what is influence? What does that really mean? In terms of, is it knowledge being passed? Is it artifacts being passed? And so it really makes it better for theory. The other thing is if you make a model, and a lot of the stuff I'm modeling here was hard to find data for. But if you make the model like we did in Medlin, then we say, well, okay, so how can we validate it? And for the Mediterranean Landscape Dynamics project, the Medlin project, the truth is that the empirical data, we're stuck with what we have. We can't change it. It's bags of dirt, little broken artifacts, charcoal and things like that. But we can change the model. So we had this idea, can we start with our model, and then can we change the model to give it output that better matches the empirical world for validation? So by building the model first, then we say, how can we validate it? How can we change our model to make it validatable, if that's a word, I don't know. So anyway, yeah, I think it's worth it, but you need to have some good goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Bom, pessoal, vou passar para acho que são 2 ou 3 perguntas que vieram online, porque a gente está no limite do horário para o coffee break. E é isso. Quem tiver mais pergunta, fica à vontade para usar o coffee break para conversar com o professor ou com a gente, que a gente vai estar disponível.
So we have 3 questions from the audience that is online. So the first one is from Pedro Henrique Norberto. He said, hi, Michael, have you tried to make a model about politics systems using ABM? How this would work in a global scale to treat like planetary problems?
Yeah. I haven't, but I have colleagues that are doing it. So some of the students in my complexity class this past year are interested in doing those kind of things. One is to how individual cognitive networks can then scale up to social cognitive networks about decision making and even polarizations. There's people at the decision theater at ASU associated with the School of Complex Adaptive Systems who are working on models to understand political polarization and how you can reduce it. So yeah, you can go to archives of models either in the NetLogo community or in ComSysNet, and there are political models there to talk about political polarization and things. So take a look at those.
Thank you. Next one is from Iago de Moraes. Hi, Michael, great talk. From what I understand, NetLogo only runs one scenario at a time, and when we need to run it several times to see whether the results are robust. Thinking about replicability, how can we systemize the robustness of a model? Example, 80% of 10K replications led to the same result?
Yeah, so so first of all, if you use behavior space in NetLogo, because it parallelizes it, you can run multiple parameterizations simultaneously. It just means it goes faster. And so, yeah, this is the question something I was going to put in, but I decided to take out an example for time. Is that when you get results and you go and analyze those, and what happens if 80% of them turn out the same and 20% of them are different? If we're trying to understand how socio-ecological processes work, then we can say that most of the time under these conditions, these are the results that we would get. If we're trying to predict the future, that's a different thing, because the future most likely would be that 80%, but it could be one of those other 20% because you only get one future. And so, again, this is why I like to think of ABMs not so much as a digital twin or predictive mechanism, but a mechanism for carrying out experiments to understand how these processes work and make decisions appropriately. If you know that 80% of the time these decisions will result in an outcome you want, that's pretty good. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but it's pretty good. If it also turns out that you look at it and your decisions, it doesn't matter. There's no central tendency to it. That's important to know too, that there's huge uncertainty.
So now we are going from the last one, from Fernando Fagundes Ferreira. He asked, a major difficulty in model design is that ABM allows the use of many parameters. How can we deal with this? Often we don't have available data to estimate the parameters. How can ABM be used for modeling the social context?
Well, so this is the one that's always a dilemma for people doing ABMs, especially once you start doing them. The temptation is keep adding more and more parameters because you think, well, this affects this, and this affects this, and this affects this, and they do, right? Again, you need good questions and think of this as a laboratory where you decide that I'm going to focus on these things and not the others, right? And then there's always the KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. And you know, and there I'll tell you one apocryphal story on this. Colleagues at University of Chicago and Argonne National Laboratory many years ago, when I was starting Medlin, they made a model of a Bronze Age city in Kindu, and it was really good. It ran on supercomputers and it had everything. You know, it had families and they could have kids with boys and girls, and they could get married, and they had dowries, and they could have sheep and goats and cattle, and they had fields outside, and there were kings and armies, and they could do all these things. They had epidemics. The king could extract corvée labor and take them away. And there's almost no publications out of Kindu. The reason is they made it so complicated that it was really hard to figure out what was actually driving some of the results, some of the emergent results that they had. And so this is something, as a modeler, you need to be very careful about. You need to be very focused and focus on the things that are important to answering the questions. But this happens all the time. So,
The kids, right?
what?
Also kids, keep it descriptive too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's right. And make it so other people can understand it. Yes. I strongly encourage that, especially with ComSysNet and OMF.
Well, então, gente, thank you, Professor. In the name of all the committee and the participants, I would like to thank you.